that you're here. Dr. Sosa is a Canadian hailing from Montreal, but grew up in upstate New York and attended undergraduate at Princeton, got a master's degree at Oxford, and then was a Halstead student and surgery resident. So spent a good portion of her training career at Johns Hopkins. Then she was recruited to Yale. So Dr. Sosa was on faculty at Yale for 10 years, promoted from assistant to associate professor, and then recruited to Duke from there as a professor and chief of endocrine surgery and the director of Surgical Center for Outcomes Research. And in spite of success at Duke, or I guess because of success at Duke, then recruited to be the professor and chair of surgery at the UCSF and the Leon Goldman Distinguished Professor and the lead of the Endocrine Neoplasia Destination Center. So Dr. Sosa is a true definition of a surgeon scientist. She has over 400 publications that are focused on outcomes research, healthcare delivery, hyperparathyroidism, and thyroid cancer, with a focus on clinical trials. She's been long-standing NIH funded on multiple editorial boards. She's the editor-in-chief of the World Journal of Surgery and editor of Greenfield Surgery. All those are great accomplishments, but what I know of Dr. Sosa is things that she's even more proud of is her role as a mentor and educator. She's received a mentoring and teaching honor from UCSF, the UCSF Muriel Steele Society Honor Roll for mentorship and sponsorship of women faculty and trainees. The NIH Great Teachers Grand Rounds invited speaker, and 2 years ago became a full member of the Master Surgeon Educators of the American College of Surgeons, and also received the UCSF Award for Chancellor Award for Diversity. Dr. Sosa is a clinical leader as well, known as an outstanding clinical endocrine surgeon. She's president currently of the American Thyroid Association and has received the Distinguished Service Award from the American Thyroid Association. Now you can see Dr. Sosa is busy and very involved in running her own department, as well as multiple activities in both research and national administrative responsibilities. So we're enormously appreciative that you would take the time to come and spend this day and a half with us and give us your Schilling lecture. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Dr. Sosa.
All right. My mom couldn't have given a better introduction. That was awesome. Thank you so very much, Dr. Wood. And really, thank you very much to the Department of Surgery at the University of Washington. What a distinguished department, and what an absolute honor it is for me to be here with you today, and to be able to talk to you about the things I'm most passionate about. Number one, science. And so I'm going to be talking about science. And I've been blown away by the science that we all enjoyed this morning. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about what science does. And I think science, for science's sake, is not really the engine, right? Science is intended to have impact and to inform change for the better, such that we can deliver the very best care to our patients and provide them the privilege of having the very best outcomes. And it sounds like, well, that's an easy recipe to follow, right? But actually it isn't, right? It isn't. It's hard to assemble the evidence and to do it rigorously. And then it's it takes courage, right, to take the evidence and potentially dispel myth, right, to compel people to abide by the evidence you assemble. And I think when you're a resident, it probably sounds unachievable, right? How do you do that? It's something that people do when they're sort of old. And today I wrote a talk for this event that's really for the learners in the audience. I mean, it's good that there's some professors here, but this is a talk that's really intended for this audience. And I really hope with this talk that people will leave today feeling empowered to do great science with great mentors and to potentially change what we do as surgeons in America and in the world. So that is what we're out to achieve. I don't know if we're gonna get to the finish line, but I hope we do. These are my financial disclosures. They pertain to medullary thyroid cancer, and today my discussion is entirely going to be about differentiated thyroid cancer. And don't worry, you don't need to know probably anything about thyroid cancer. Anything you need to know, I'm going to teach you. So we're going to go back in time when I was a learner. And so this was, I don't know, around 2002, give or take, maybe a couple of years. And this portrait hangs in the Halstead building in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins. And have any of you been there? It's kind of a awesome place. But a lot of people know this picture, not because I'm famous. I'm the only one smiling in like any of the hallways. And my point is just that as you learn about me, I'm sort of eternally happy, optimistic person. And I think that's how I've gotten through the last several years and how I've gotten through a lot of other challenges. So, you know, I'm always on the web playing software and stuff. And this is software that was intended to make me look like someone from the Renaissance. I don't know, did it achieve it? I don't know. Like, right. Maybe it does. I guess I've been cryopreserved. But I just wanted to start with myself because we're going to go back in time a little bit. And I was a liberal arts major, and I love to read. It's one of my favorite things to do in my free time. And I, in college, read a lot of the classics. Who read classics? You're probably ashamed to say, oh, no, okay, all right. I got kindred spirits here. So I love to read the classics. And I got to thinking one day, I don't know why I was thinking about this. I was like, what if some of the great thinkers and philosophers were surgeons? Have you ever thought that question? No, right? But I was one day. It was a Saturday. So I think if Aristotle was a surgeon, he obviously wasn't, he would have been a clinical surgeon. So why do I say that? So this is just one of many quotes from Aristotle. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an art, but a habit, right? So the principle of practice makes perfect. But I think if Socrates had been a surgeon, he wasn't, he would have been probably a surgeon scientist or an academic surgeon. Why? Well, he said, I know that I don't know. And to know is to know that you know nothing. That is the meaning of true knowledge, right? So isn't that what drives us as scientists? So then it's like a peanut butter cup. You put the peanut butter and the chocolate together and you say, what is a surgeon scientist? And I think for a very long time, maybe too long, a surgeon scientist really was defined in a very specific way. It was a man who worked in a basic science laboratory, a wet lab. And this sort of unicorn was expected to be the triple threat, right? You're an expert clinician, you're a fabulous researcher, and an unbelievably compelling educator, right? And I grew up in Baltimore, and of course, William Stewart Halstead, right, is elevated to the pedestal as someone who personifies those traits. I would say that in real life, and we're all in real life, I think that's almost certainly unobtainable to be great at everything, right? And I think the modern academic surgeon really should be striving to be excellent in perhaps one or two dimensions. And I think we need to embrace the fact that an academic surgeon should not just be one phenotype, right? And we just duplicate that a million times, but rather we should build a surgical community that is populated by many different phenotypes, all of which are equally spectacular, equally important to the success of the community. But each person is different, and it's the principle of diversity, right? It's the principle of diversity. But I think it really is the secret of how we build a surgical community. So we need basic scientists, right? We need clinical and health services researchers. We need educators. We need global surgery, health equity experts. We need teachers, clinicians, and ultimately, when we put it together, it becomes a chimera. Right? It becomes a chimera. And I'm going to argue that, you know, a bouquet of 12 white roses is indeed beautiful, but a bouquet of 12 roses of many different colors is perhaps even more beautiful. And I think the important thing, right, is when you look at something, we all don't see the same thing, right? This is the blue dress, right? We all know it. Depending on what your retina looks like, you may see a blue dress, or you may see a brown or a gold dress, right? And all of those things are equally accurate for each of us, right? And so in the end, how do we resolve this, right? So I've set us up maybe to fail. On the one hand, we want to embrace creativity, discovery, innovation. But on the other hand, there's this practice makes perfect, right? You do the same thing a million times, you get better at it, and that suggests you shouldn't depart and change things. So a lot of people argue that this phenomenon of the academic surgeon is an impossibility, right? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. And I don't think it is impossible for each and every person in this audience to aspire to do this. But I think you have to be incredibly aspirational and ambitious. And you need to have the courage to take discoveries. It's not enough to make the discovery and write up the discovery, but then you have to advocate for it and you have to execute, right, to make sure that it is actionable. Okay, so that's the hypothetical, and now we're going to apply those principles. And I'm eventually going to get to the perspective of the learner in all of this. And the learner is going to be the main character, the hero or heroine, the shero in the story. So the story is going to be a personal one. So I only know about a few diseases, and one of them is thyroid cancer. So we're going to stay in my comfort zone, and we're going to talk about differentiated thyroid cancer. And so we always start with epidemiology. And so this is the epidemiology of thyroid cancer in the United States. There was an explosion of thyroid cancer over the last 30 years. The incidence of the disease, I think, increased more than 300%. In fact, I used to say, literally, there is a pandemic of thyroid cancer because this phenomenon has been seen in every developed and developing country in the world. And then after COVID-19, I've just gone back to saying it's an epidemic. So a lot of people say, well, what? That is crazy. I've never seen a figure like that. What is going on? So the first point I want to make to you is it is amazing how threadbare sometimes evidence is that supports practice. And so when you look for explanation for this epidemiologic phenomenon, you find that until very recently, there was one and only one pivotal study that had been published to explain it. And everyone took it as true. These are some of the pivotal figures from that paper published by Welch and Davies in JAMA in 2006. And starting in the upper left-hand corner, what you see is that the incidence of all histologies of thyroid cancer increased over this 30-year time period. But papillary thyroid cancer, a unique histology, was largely the driver of this change. Then if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you see that it was the smallest tumors, those tumors less than 1 centimeter in size, which we call papillary thyroid microcarcinomas, that again appear to be the engine for change. And then perhaps the most important, and now maybe the most infamous figure in that paper is the one in the center, where you see yet again that rise in incidence, and you see at the bottom a very flat mortality line, which led the authors to say, quote, "We believe increased diagnostic scrutiny is the most likely explanation for the apparent increase in incidence." That is, it is all overdiagnosis, right? And we've heard this theme before for other diseases. Well, we all know this figure too. It's an iceberg, and you all know a little bit iceberg above the water, a whole lot of iceberg below the water, and the whole truth is often hidden from view. I don't want to get political today. We got a little political yesterday at dinner, but I would say just as the icebergs are melting, so too might be truth in America. And I'll tell you, I read that Welch and Davies paper 100 times if I read it once. And I kept going back to that last figure I showed you. So there it is again on the left side, where you see the green showing rising incidence and the black showing deaths flat. And why did I keep looking at that figure? I kept looking at it because the incidence number is a really big number, okay? It's somewhere between 40 and 50,000 new cases of thyroid cancer identified every year in the United States. But as many of you may know about thyroid cancer, it's a super indolent disease, and it is the exceptional patient who dies of their disease. Survival at a decade is probably around 98.5 or 99%. So what bothered me is that you have a really big number in green and a really tiny number in black, and they're both on an arithmetic Y scale. And I hypothesized that could it be that we are muting or camouflaging real change in mortality, demonstrating the data in this way? Well, listen, I'm not a biostatistician, I'm not an epidemiologist, but next takeaway in life is you don't have to be. It's just important to have friends who are. And so, yeah, it pays off to have smart friends. So I called up a friend, Carrie Kitahara. She's a very well-known cancer epidemiologist at the NCI. And I said, Carrie, I'm going to send you over some data, raw data. Can you take the data and put them on a logarithmic scale and send it back? Took her about an hour and a half. And she sent me back the figure on the right, which subsequently appeared in Nature. And what does it show? Well, not a lot different on the incidence side. You see incidence rising yet again, annual percentage change of 5.6%. But now what you see is something very different in mortality, and that is mortality is actually increasing over this period. And the reason why your eyebrows should go up is that we all know we've been winning the war against cancer. There are only a few cancer diagnoses where we are losing the war. One, hepatocellular carcinoma, but number 2 now is thyroid cancer. And just by challenging what you think you know with something potentially super simple, you too can have a JAMA publication. So this is our JAMA publication from 2017. And what this paper was is just a reiteration of Welch and Davies 2006, but with two important changes, just two changes. So starting on the incidence side, like Welch and Davies, we use the SEER9 data set. I'm sure many people in this audience use or have used SEER, represents about 10% of the US population, has a ton of really important demographic, clinical, and pathologic data which you need for adjustment. Like Welch and Davies, we got our mortality data from death certificate information from the National Center for Health Statistics. But then we changed the first thing from Welch and Davies, and that is instead of measuring mortality, we chose to measure incidence-based mortality. And for those of you who studied death or mortality before, you'll know incidence-based mortality is probably a better outcome to use when there is a paucity of that outcome. And of course, thyroid cancer is an indolent disease, and there are very few deaths. Then, like Welch and Davies, we calculated age-adjusted rates, annual percentage changes, and joint point regression analysis. But then we changed the second thing from Welch and Davies, and that was a graphic change, how we demonstrated our data. And instead of using an arithmetic scale on the y-axis, we moved to a semi-log scale. So let's see what those two small changes did with regard to the conclusion. So starting on the incidence side, maybe some surprises here, and that is you certainly see localized disease, so thyroid cancer confined to the thyroid, increasing the fastest with an annual percentage change of 4.6% per year. But now we see regional and distant disease incidence also rising, and rising quickly, right? Not sure that supports a conclusion that this is all overdiagnosis. Again, people succumb to distant metastatic disease. Then we looked at size. Remember, those tiny tumors, less than 1 centimeter, called papillary thyroid microcarcinomas. Indeed, they are increasing the fastest at 9.3% per year. But now you see tumors of all sizes increasing, including tumors greater than 4 centimeters. So these are tumors about the size of a ball ball in the neck. And I don't think you can argue that that is overdiagnosis. Now, flipping to incidence-based mortality. And here we start to see very different conclusions from those reached by Welch and Davies, where we see cancer of all stages, the incidence-based mortality increasing at rates as high as 2.9% per year in the case of patients with distant metastatic disease. And then something really interesting. Incidence-based mortality for tumors of all sizes increased, including for the smallest tumors, those under 2 centimeters in size, which to me suggests potentially the biologic profile, the molecular makeup, mutations are changing as an underpinning of the disease. So what are the implications of such? Well, like Welch and Davies, we agree, incidence rapidly increasing more than threefold over 30 years, impacting all demographic subgroups and especially papillary thyroid cancer. But in contradiction to Welch and Davies, we don't agree that incidence-based mortality or even mortality are level, but rather this too increased over this time period, and it impacted all demographic subgroups, and especially papillary thyroid cancer. So where do we finish? Well, I agree with Welch and Davies about some of it, and that is overdiagnosis is definitely part, and maybe a large part of the explanation. But I think we may be oversimplifying the problem, and I think we are doing our patients a disservice if we say, don't care about thyroid cancer since it is all overdiagnosis. So very different implications. Well, you got to follow through when you sort of, challenge people, because when we published this paper, people immediately and appropriately came back to me and said, all right, so if it isn't all overdiagnosis, Julian, then what is it? Well, it's an opportunity, right, to do more science. And so this was a follow-up study that we did looking for alternative explanations. And almost certainly overweight and obesity are a large part of the balance of the explanation. We all know there's been an epidemic of obesity and overweight in the United States. But here we went through an analytic model attributing thyroid cancer to overweight and obesity. And you probably know many different cancer diagnoses have now been found to have significant associations with overweight and obesity. But if you look at all incident thyroid cancers today, and you do a parsed out model, what you'll find is that nearly 20% of these incident cases are likely attributable in the United States to overweight and obesity. And overweight and obesity actually seems to be associated with the more aggressive cancers, say those larger than 4 centimeters in size, where based on our analysis that appears in JNCI, nearly 60% of these very large tumors are attributable to overweight and obesity. And remember, these are the kinds of tumors from which people actually succumb. Well, should we stand around and wring our hands about this, right? And as scientists, if we're just content with the science, we might, but we can't be, right? We have to leverage the science to impart change and change for the better. So what we did was we weaponized these data, and I think many different specialties have done that, using evidence to inform practice guidelines. So I write guidelines, many others in this audience do. And so our guidelines to tackle the question of overdiagnosis have recommended higher biopsy thresholds. We've recommended now with the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force against screening asymptomatic adult Americans for thyroid nodules and thyroid cancer. And we've changed the lexicon of thyroid cancer. And with those very recent changes, you can see that we as a medical and surgical community can transform epidemiology, and you see the start of the flattening of the curve. Well, is stuff really changing in a new way? I would argue sometimes change is going back to where we were. And it's sort of like a process of evolution. Where we are today, in some ways in the field of endocrine neoplasia and thyroid cancer, resembles where we were maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And these are the guidelines. So for the learners in the audience, I'm going to be talking about guidelines and about the evidence that underpins guidelines. But guidelines are available not only to physicians, but also to patients. And there's not a week in clinic that goes by when some patient doesn't come to me and ask me if I am accountable to the American Thyroid Association guidelines. And a lot of people, when they read guidelines, immediately go to either the recommendations or the references, right? And I always say pause before doing either of those things and start by looking at the authors of the guidelines. And the reason I say that is all of us, right, carry with us implicit bias. It may be from the personal truth, the life we've lived. It may be because we've generated some of the evidence which leaves us lacking objectivity and favoring our own results. So I always, when I look at guidelines, I'm like, who are the authors? So these are the authors of the current iteration of the guidelines published in 2016 from the American Thyroid Association. American Thyroid Association, super equitable organization, 2 otolaryngologists, 2 endocrine surgeons, 2 had been on prior guidelines, 2 of us were newbies. Nothing surprising here, we're still working on gender equity. And I don't know if anyone heard that, but okay. Yeah, it's okay. You know, are these guidelines unique? Well, I'm not sure they are. I think the very best guidelines share tenets and principles, especially guidelines that pertain to cancer. You know, I think all guidelines, you want to improve survival, you want to reduce the risk of recurrence, you want to facilitate surveillance, you want to permit staging. But I think a new tenet that is an underpinning of all of the best guidelines today is that we really need to try to minimize treatment-related morbidity. And I'm not sure that's a novel principle. I think it's something that intuitively each of us does every day in our clinics when we see patients, where on the one hand, we want to avoid over-treating indolent disease, and on the other hand, we want to avoid under-treating that disease that is clinically significant. And how do we do it? You know how we do it, right? We have to weigh long-term outcome uncertainty. We want to put the patient increasingly at the epicenter of making decisions. Unfortunately, we have to weigh costs and medical legal considerations. And I would say if there is an area of controversy in thyroid cancer that is timeless and that I'm not sure ever will go away, it is how much thyroid surgery should we do for low-risk thyroid cancers. And for the learners in the audience, a low-risk thyroid cancer, differentiated thyroid cancer, is a tumor that's 1 to 4 centimeters in size, confined to the thyroid, that is not spread to the lymph nodes. And this is the age-old question: should we take out the whole thyroid, or should we take out half of the thyroid, called a lobectomy? And so those people who argue for total thyroidectomy say, well, up to 75% of the time, the disease is multifocal and even bilateral. Don't we sometimes want to give radioactive iodine in the postoperative setting? And don't we want to zero out on a thyroglobulin level in order to permit long-term surveillance? But then those who counter and say, let's do a lobectomy, say, who wants to be on thyroid hormone supplementation, let alone replacement? In the end, it's an indolent disease. Nobody dies. More surgery means more complications. And of course, in the end, show me a survival benefit. And so there was one study for many, many years, just one study, that showed a survival benefit. And that one study drove practice for many years. And this is that study, very famous study, published by Dr. Villamoria in 2007, presented at the American Surgical Association, looking at more than 52,000 patients using the NCDB. We saw at least one of our learners use that for the presentation this morning. And they asked the simple question: if you have a lobectomy or a total thyroidectomy, are you more or less likely to die? And here is, cut to the chase, here is the famous table from that pivotal paper. And what it basically shows is that if you undergo thyroid lobectomy, you're perhaps as much as 31% more likely to die than if you have a total thyroidectomy. Now that's pretty compelling. And as a result of really this super important pivotal paper, the American Thyroid Association for nearly a decade said do total thyroidectomy for all patients with differentiated thyroid cancer. But then for that paper site, sort of the way I scratched my head looking at that figure from Welch and Davies, sort of started to wonder, and I want to clarify, they didn't wonder about Dr. Villamoria, who is an exceptional surgeon scientist. It's never about the person, it's about the data. And people wondered about the data set that had been deployed, because when you actually looked at that data set, it was missing potentially a number of variables that you want to have because they're known to be associated with survival. And then Mendelsohn, I always give credit to Mendelsohn, this is an oft-overlooked study, but super important one. In 2010, did a study of 22,000 patients and was unable to replicate a difference in survival between the two surgical strategies. So if you learn one thing about me today, other than I'm a pretty happy person, is that I like to ask old questions in new ways. And so what did we do in this study? So this study was led by this man, and I'm going to introduce him to you. His name is Mohammed Adam, and he's the first author of this paper, the first of several papers I'm going to show you. And at the time, he was a preliminary resident at Duke University. This paper subsequently was presented at the American Surgical Association and essentially replicates the Villa-Moria study, but with an enriched database. So we went back to the National Cancer Database, asked if they had or could assemble some missing variables that we know are associated with survival. And then we did a very similar multivariate regression analysis looking at their association with survival. Here are the demographics comparing lobectomy and total thyroidectomy. You see a very large number of patients, nearly 62,000 patients in this cohort. You'll see a lot of highly significant p-values. I would argue these are artifacts from the size of the database. I really don't think that these are clinically relevant, but these definitely are, and none of them are surprising. What you see is a greater incidence of multifocality, extrathyroidal extension, nodal and distant metastasis, positive surgical margins, and radioactive iodine used in the total thyroidectomy group. But these were all missing in the NCDB at the time of the 2007 study. So when we then repeated that analysis, but this time with enriched data, we came to a very different conclusion. And that is that survival is equivalent for both total thyroidectomy and thyroid lobectomy. So the ATA guidelines from 2009, based on the Villa-Moria study, said do a total thyroidectomy, except for a few contraindications. But then, of course, the newest recommendation in 2015, largely the result of Dr. Adams' study, is that either total thyroidectomy or thyroid lobectomy can be performed with equivalent long-term outcomes, although clearly the two surgical procedures have very different short-term outcomes. Well, am I trying to argue for y'all that we should be telling patients to have a thyroid lobectomy? No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that we definitely should be giving options to patients and affording them the power to make the best decision for them based on their values and their preferences. Well, let's jump a millimeter outside of the thyroid gland and talk about another super big controversy in endocrine surgery and American thyroidology, and that is the status of the lymph nodes in the neck all around the thyroid. And for the learners in the audience, you know, the ABSITE and the boards love to ask about staging, cancer staging. And one of their favorite questions to ask is about thyroid cancer staging, because it makes no sense. Okay, it just makes no sense. And what a great opportunity to ask people about it, because if you don't know it, you wouldn't intuitively. And I'm showing you here the 7th edition. The 8th edition is changed in only one way. Instead of using a threshold of 40, the threshold has changed to 55. But basically the principle is this, is if you were under 40 years of age, now 55 years of age, you can only be stage 1 or 2 differentiated thyroid cancer. And the difference between stage 1 and 2 is simple. If you have disease outside of your neck, you're stage 2. If your neck is riddled with thyroid cancer, but you have no cancer outside of your neck, you're stage 1. It's as simple as that. But if you're over 40 in the 7th edition, now over 55 in the 8th edition, you can be stage 1, 2, 3, or 4. Having lymph nodes in the neck is not forgiven, and you are upstaged for their presence. The wacky thing, right? This is very unique among all cancer staging, that we use an age cutoff or an age threshold. And that just strikes me as weird, right? Like, what is different about thyroid cancer than every other solid tumor known to man? And you know where I'm going with this, right? Like, if something doesn't make sense, maybe it doesn't make sense for a reason. So here's Mohammed Adam. Now he's accepted to the categorical general surgery training program at Duke. When you presented the American, I think you can advance in surgical training. And this study was published in JCO with an impact factor of something like 30 or 35. And Dr. Adam led the team and asked two simple questions. Is it really true that having metastatic lymph nodes in your neck does not compromise your survival if you are young? And say, if it does the volume of disease potentially impact survival? So to answer this question, we used two large national data sets. We've talked about them both before, NCDB and SEER. These were our inclusion and exclusion criteria, both super powerful because they allow you to adjust for important demographic, pathologic, and clinical variables. And again, we're predicting survival. So here's the very simple design. So we looked exclusively at young patients. Remember, that's that unique group under age 45. We did this in the 7th edition. We've repeated this in the 8th edition, and all the findings hold true. And we divided young people into two groups: those who did not have metastatic disease in their lymph nodes in the neck, and those who did have metastatic disease in the lymph nodes. And then we compared their survival. And why did we compare survival? Because that's what staging does. Staging is not intended, at least currently, to predict recurrence. It's intended to predict survival. So we use very conventional, unadjusted, and adjusted survival analysis. And I'm going to share a little trick, a little tool in my toolkit. And if you're not already asleep from this talk, please don't go to sleep now, because this is not heavy, and it's actually super simple and super powerful. And that is, we decided to use, Dr. Adam decided to use restrictive cubic splines. So a lot of people are like, I have never heard of those. What is that? So you're driving on the highway here in Seattle, and you hear the police siren behind you. You know you were going too fast. You know you're not going to run the police, so you slam on the brakes, right? What we know is that the faster you are traveling in your car, that's on the x-axis, the longer it takes to stop, right? The farther you go before you stop. So that is a linear association between the dependent and independent variable. And that's what a regression analysis presumes linearity. But unfortunately, not all associations are linear. So you heard, I'm from Montreal. In Montreal, there are only two temperatures, cold and colder. And so this is seasonal variation in temperatures in Montreal. And then I tried to fit a straight line. But of course, you cannot fit a straight line because they are not linearly associated. So what do restrictive cubic splines do? Just to probably oversimplify, they relax the assumption of linearity that is otherwise frequently made in multivariable regression analysis. So you can say, all right, I think I understand that, apply it. So we're going to apply it. So here what we did was we predict death. I'm not predicting survival, I'm predicting death. And in the dotted line, you see young people with metastatic disease in their lymph nodes. And in the solid line, you see young patients without metastatic disease in the lymph nodes. And of course, what do we see? We see a clinically and statistically significant difference in the risk of death between those two groups. We should not see this based on the current HACC UICC staging system. We then move out of NCDB to SEER, and we see an even larger gap between these two groups of young people based on whether they do or don't have metastatic disease in the lymph nodes. And does the volume or burden of disease appear to be associated with survival? It sure does. And here what we see is that each incremental metastatic lymph node up to the number 6 imparts compromised survival. And then after the number of 6, you no longer see this association. So you could say, so what are the implications of that? So the implications are, in contradistinction to what the HACC UICC staging system says, cervical lymph node metastases do appear to be associated with survival in young people. And therefore, the current HACC staging systems almost certainly understage young patients. And then, of course, the conclusion I think we probably could draw is that if we are understaging young people, we are also potentially under-treating young patients. Now, I'm not strong and powerful like the HACC US, but I can change what I do each and every day in my clinic, right? We have the power of one to change what we do. And so what have I done with these findings? Now I very rigorously, preoperatively ultrasound the entire neck of all my patients, including and especially my young patients, because I want to do simultaneous lymph node dissection with my thyroid operation if I need to. Well, I wanted to finish with one more example of where a resident can transform practice. So you're probably looking at this and be like, oh, I know what she's going to talk about. You know, she's going to talk about practice makes perfect. The more you do, the better you are, the volume outcomes association. Well, I'm going to stick with one thing, and that is Dr. Adam. Now, Dr. Adam is a senior categorical general surgery resident at Duke University. And he made a very interesting observation. And that is when he looked in the endocrine surgery literature and volume outcome studies, and there were a million of them, like a million of them. The weird thing is that all of them treated surgeon volume as a categorical variable, when in fact, it is a continuous variable, right? Like I do 6 thyroids a year, he does 25, she does 125, right? It's a continuous variable. But if you treat something as a categorical variable, you're probably going to understand the outliers, the high and low outliers very well. But with continuous variable treatment, you're much more likely to understand all volume areas. So here is annual surgeon volume of total thyroidectomy in the United States at a national level, ranges from 1 to 157, highly skewed. So we took those restrictive cubic splines and we asked the question, is there a threshold for surgeon volume that makes a difference? And lo and behold, there actually is, and the number is 25. And the interesting thing is if you go back to all those studies that were published in the area, treating it as a categorical variable, none of them use the number 25. So, for the first time, this is relatively recent publication, for the first time, we understand probably what a high and low volume thyroid surgery is. It's based on 25 total thyroidectomies a year. And when you use this evidence-based criterion, not surprisingly, you see that low volume surgeons patients have many more complications and as a result, longer length of stay and higher costs. And this is the disturbing fact, right? So are we doing something about this? Well, not yet. Why? Because more than half of surgeons today in the United States who do total thyroidectomy do just 1 per year. And I will understand associations are not causation, but this is a really compelling dose response association up to the number 25. So what do we conclude? Yeah, surgeon volume significantly associated with outcomes, but there's actually a threshold for this one. Maybe not age for the other one, but for this there is, and it looks like it's 25. And sadly, in this country, the majority of patients undergoing thyroid surgery are seeing low volume surgeons. So you could say, well, that's all very interesting and good, but in the end, does it matter? It's thyroid surgery. It sure does. Thyroid surgery is one of the 10 most commonly performed operations in the United States. And about a week after Dr. Adams' paper was published in the Annals of Surgery, he received phone calls from the New York Times and the Washington Post. Why? Because thyroid surgery is so common and because the findings and potential implications were so dramatic. This is what you can do as a resident with the amazing microclimate that you have here at the University of Washington and the extraordinary faculty that exists here in the Department of Surgery. So where do I want to leave you? So I think the first thing is that we all hate change, right? Unless you're a baby. And I said this yesterday. If you're a baby, everything's new, right? Change is not hard. But for the rest of us, change is wicked hard, right? It's hard because you have to unlearn and then relearn, right? That takes a lot of energy. But I think all of us should work towards being engines of good change. And so I'm never satisfied with what I've done. There's always more questions to ask, more science to do, potentially more change to evolve. So I think our data are out of date for our current ATA thyroid cancer guidelines. So I have the privilege really of helping Dr. Ringel from Ohio State co-chair the group writing guides. Remember, I always say, start with the group that is writing the guidelines, and these are our surgeon co-authors. Well, what are some takeaways from this talk? Well, the first takeaway is, you heard, I keep talking about differentiated thyroid cancer again and again and again. And I think the takeaway here is build the body of research. And I would, this may sound a little like, not Trumpian, but like something real estate, but like, don't build this way, build this way. Assemble work that is predicated on your prior work, where you become the world expert in something. You can do anything, but you probably can't do everything. Secondly, and I'm like the 100th person today to say it, but mentors are critically important. And I think they have a really unique role in your lives as learners, and that is to generate the questions. Sometimes the questions are new, but sometimes the questions are old, but they're being asked in new ways. And I'm a graduate of Princeton, so anytime you graduate from Princeton, they indoctrinate you. You got to have an Einstein quote. And this is definitely my favorite Einstein quote. If I had an hour to solve a problem your life depended on it, I'd use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. Definitely true. But also, you know, we talk a lot about mentors. Sadly, there are probably more bad mentors in the world than there are good mentors. And what's the takeaway? I think all of us have to own ourselves, right? We ultimately are who we are, and we have to actively seek out the best mentors, seek out the best training to become the best versions of ourselves. Why do I get up every morning? Is it to publish papers, to do experiments? It absolutely is not. What gets me up every morning is today. This is like the zenith of my year. It is the legacy I'm looking at. The legacy is people. It is all of you who are going to be the future. You are the future of American surgery. So this was Dr. Adam when he finally graduated from Duke. Where do you think Dr. Adam is now? Yeah. Yeah, baby. So here's Dr. Adam. He is now an assistant professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And I guess my point is, form bonds with your mentors that can last a lifetime, and they can be transformative for both the mentee, and I'll be honest, he has transformed me. You heard earlier from the Schilling Faculty Award winner. Serendipity is so critical, and this is not me. Julie Freischlag talks about this all of the time. A lot of the success I've had in my life has come from chance and, frankly, good luck. But I'm always open to chance, and I'm always open to good luck. But in the end, you have to bring courage. If you're going to challenge people, challenge what they believe, you better have the courage to do it. It's important not only for science, but it's important for all phases of our lives, certainly when it comes to social justice. This was a recent, I love this, this was a recent debate, discussion, argument on Twitter. where people were really saying that there's not enough change in surgery, and whatever change is happening, it's not happening fast enough. I would say both those statements are true. I would say each of us, not just leaders, but each of us is a leader. You have the power to be a thought leader, has to own this and have the courage to evolve the change. And I actually think it is our youngest colleagues who will best drive change. And is change happening? Oh my goodness, it sure is. How many people went to the Academic Surgical Congress this last year? It was an incredible event. Look at how the leadership of the Association for Academic Surgery has changed. Incredible diversity and uniformly spectacular young academic surgeons, leaders of the future. And then this debate, I love this debate. This was an argument on Twitter about what's the best discovery or advancement that's happened in American surgery over the last 30 years. And people were like, you know, robot, laparoscopy. And I was like, no way. It's diversification of surgery, hands down. And I do hope that all of you, when you leave today, regardless of how strong and powerful and successful a warrior you have been, all of us can and must do better and do more. And I wanted to finish with a slide that sort of brings it all together with science and diversity. And you have seen this all day today. The best research teams are diverse. And I've always worked really hard to surround myself with people who are smarter than I am and who have skills that are complementary to mine. They're different skills. And this was just published 2 weeks ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. And a lot of people at UCSF, when we published this paper, was about cancer screening, that's another whole talk. But my point is, everyone's like, who are those people? I never even heard of your co-authors. Where are they? What do they do? Where are they? What departments of surgery are they in? And none of them are surgeons. None of them are physicians. They are all healthcare economists. And what's my point? My point is, I had an idea. I had a clinical question. I didn't know how to answer the question. I didn't even know where to start. But I found people who were smarter than I was, who had skills vastly different than mine. And together, magic happens. So team science, and make sure your team is diverse. On behalf of UCSF Surgery, thank you so much for the privilege of the program.
So, welcome to University of Washington. We are excited